Good morning. Welcome to today's Uganda webinar. My name is Jan Petter Holtedal. I am project leader for the evaluation department's work producing country evaluation briefs. The department has been producing such country evaluation briefs, or CEBs, since 2016. The CEBs are synthesis studies based on existing evaluations of the international development assistance to Norway's partner countries. The purpose is to present systematically collected knowledge about this assistance in an accessible and user-friendly form to its intended users in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, at embassies, and in Norad. All the CEBs are available at norad.no/CEB. The Evaluation Department has now produced 17 CEBs with accompanying evaluation portraits consisting of short summaries or the evaluations underlying each CEB, including links to these evaluation reports. Today we will present and discuss the main findings of the CEB for Uganda. With us today we have three panelists with in-depth knowledge about developments in Uganda. They will be introduced to you in a moment. In the first part of today's webinar, each of our three contributors will present their perspectives on the development support to Uganda and the challenges currently facing the country, followed by a dialogue during the latter half of the webinar. With that, I wish you a pleasant and useful webinar. Our first speaker today is Pernille Sørensen, who has written the country evaluation brief on Uganda on behalf of Partnership, the Evaluation Department's consultant for this assignment. Pernille has in-depth knowledge and understanding about development challenges in Uganda and about the cooperation with various donors to the country. In a moment, she will present to us the main evaluation findings of the Uganda country evaluation brief. Pernille, it is a pleasure to have you with us. The floor is yours.
Good morning. I'm going to present the country evaluation brief for Uganda. It's based on 26 evaluation reports from 2013 to the beginning of 2020. And I'll say some words about some specific sectors and areas, but also some more general lessons learned across the whole program portfolio. First, I'll say a few words about aid in Uganda. The government of Uganda has an ambition of Uganda becoming an upper middle income country by 2040. However, despite this ambition, Uganda is still one of the most aid-dependent countries in Africa. The focus of the donor is very much on social infrastructure and services, and these include health, education and wash being water and sanitation and hygiene, and these are all subsectors which are heavily underfunded by the government. Apart from that, there's a high level of humanitarian assistance. It is estimated that currently there are around 1.4 million refugees in Uganda. The main donors to Uganda are the US, the World Bank, the UK, Regional Development Bank and the EU. And US is by far the largest donor to Uganda. The size of the aid to US is more than double than the size of the aid of the World Bank. Aid to Uganda has been very much affected by corruption and fraud. In 2012, there was a very serious case of corruption in the northern region, where even the Prime Minister's office was involved. And the donors responded to this by suspending and heavily reducing the budget support. And there was a general reprogramming from budget support to project interventions and basket funding. Apart from that, aid in Uganda has been affected by the human rights situation. This is in particular the Anti-Homosexuality Act, which I'll come back to. Budget support has been one of the main channels for aid to Uganda up to 2013, and there are therefore quite a number of evaluation reports. On the positive side, the evaluation pointed to budget support having covered sector expenditures, it had enhanced policy design and implementation, it had improved efficiency and maintenance. On the negative side, however, there was a problem of reaching sector targets, there was weak sustainability due to low revenue mobilization, and there was limited local implementation capacity. And the whole reprogramming from budget support to project intervention also had the negative effects on the donor-government relation. There was less cooperation, and there was also less donor harmonization. Governance, civil society, and human rights is a very important area for aid to Uganda, and this is mainly due to the political, social, cultural, and economic rights being challenged. One case in point is the 2014 Anti-Homosexuality Act, and this act prescribes all lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender persons lifetime prison. When this act was endorsed in 2014, the donors responded by economic sanctions, loans were postponed, and aid was halted. Another serious issue with regard to human rights and civil society is the CSO law, which is seriously restricting the political space for CSO. However, despite the CSO law, there are quite a number of CSO projects focusing on human rights, which are having positive results. The evaluation found that some of these projects had increased the capacity to promote and protect human rights in the rural areas. Agriculture and climate change, another important area, Uganda being predominantly agricultural country. There's a very high population growth in Uganda of 3.7, and the current agricultural production cannot keep pace with this population growth, and there's therefore a need for food import. And this has led the government to have another goal of 2040, and this is that by 2040 the current subsistence farming should be transformed into commercial agriculture. And this is also the reason why many of the agriculture projects focus on agribusiness and value chains. The evaluation found that the projects are led to a short-term production increase, and also that there was an employment and income increase. However, on the negative side, the evaluation found that the climate change impacts were not sufficiently addressed, and generally there was a need for green growth solutions in the projects. Resilience, food and nutrition security is also a very important area for aid, mainly due to the many refugees in Uganda. But apart from that, Cambodia is also receiving humanitarian assistance. Cambodia is one of the poorest areas in the world. Cambodia is located in the northeastern part of Uganda. And Cambodia is receiving emergency aid, but apart from that, there are also livelihood and resilience projects. The evaluation report found that aid was effective, but it was less sustainable. This was due to the short duration of the project, but also due to the limited resources at the local government level. The refugees, apart from the emergency aid, are having wash, livelihoods and income-generating activities, and the evaluation found that the multi-sector and the multi-organization approach was far more effective than the individual CSO or NGO approach or projects. The evaluation also found there was a need for more focus on environmental management and also energy-saving technologies. Coming to the cross-cutting issue, gender is of course one of the main cross-cutting issues. There has been quite some development in this area. Gender is having a very high percentage of educated women, mainly of course in the urban area. So however, the problems remain in the rural areas where there's a high level of discrimination, the women are experiencing low status, there's high illiteracy levels, etc. The evaluation found that project had somehow tried to mainstream gender, but it often appeared to be add-on and it was often not truly integrated. It also found that the project seemed to focus more on gender participation than having a thorough gender understanding, looking into gender-based roles, division of labor, decision-making, and designing the projects on basis of these gender roles. This was the same for the evaluations, that this very seldom had a thorough gender analysis. They were simply just examining these few, whether they had it mainstream, and it mainly focused on looking at gender participation rather than having a thorough gender analysis. Lastly, or almost lastly, I'm going to say a few words, some few lessons learned across the project portfolio. Most of the project, if not all, were found to be well aligned with national policies and strategies. Most of the projects were also found to deliver results. Of course, this was with some varying degree. There was a need for focus on climate change adaptation. I already mentioned that in relation to the agriculture project, but also in relation to the project in the refugee camps. Sustainability was an issue across the whole project portfolio, and this was mainly due to the low government resources, but also the low revenue mobilization. Poor gender mainstreaming was a problem, as I already mentioned. And with regard to the CSO projects, that despite them generating some good result, the limited coverage of the CSO project was an issue or problem. And also lastly, the evaluation found that in many cases the monitoring of the project needed to be improved. Lastly, a few gaps on looking ahead. In my view, there's a need for more focus on family planning. I already mentioned the very high population growth, and since health sector is already largely donor funded, I think this is one area where the donor could play a more important role. I also think that humanitarian assistance to the refugee needs to be re-examined, and there needs to be a more focus on a differentiated approach. Quite many of the refugees have been in Uganda for decades. This is particularly the case in the southwestern part of Uganda. Some of them have maybe been in Uganda for 20 years in refugee camps receiving humanitarian assistance. However, they are still receiving the same amount of humanitarian assistance as new coming refugees, for instance, in the north. Even though that the refugees who've been there for many years, they are relatively well established economically. Looking ahead, I think there will be a need for more aid due to the reduced economic growth as consequence of COVID-19. We all know that this has led to increased poverty in all the developing countries or in the global south. However, at the same time, the donor-government relationship is seriously challenged in Uganda. This is mainly due to the 2012 fraud, the general human rights situation, but also more lately to the election in January 2021, where there also was abuse of human rights. And I think this is one of the issues or topics we are going to discuss in the discussion. So, thank you very much. This is what I wanted to present. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Pernille. Many very interesting points there. We will have a chance to revisit some of those points in the dialogue after the next two presentations. Now, we are very pleased to have with us Senior Advisor Xenia Chrysostomidis, former Minister Counselor at the Norwegian Embassy in Kampala, who will share with us her perspective on the Uganda CEB and developments in the country. Please go ahead, Xenia.
Many thanks for inviting me to comment on the country evaluation brief for Uganda. And thank you also to the author of the report and to Norad for providing this opportunity to focus on Uganda during a challenging time for the country in the immediate aftermath of the recent presidential and parliamentarian elections and during the global pandemic of COVID-19. As you might know, the Norwegian Parliament has made Uganda one of 10 partner countries for long-term development assistance. A recently published country strategy will guide the priorities for our development assistance going forward. We want to ensure an active partnership with Uganda and engage with them on a range of bilateral and multilateral issues. The starting point for this cooperation is Agenda 2030 and the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Uganda was among the first countries that aligned its national priorities with the SDGs. Unfortunately, the corona crisis is making further progress challenging, not only for Uganda, but for many of the world's poorest countries. And Norway has therefore, since March last year, prioritized giving support to COVID-19 related projects. A quick point on multilateral support to Uganda, which is emphasized in the report. Over half of Norwegian development assistance goes through multilateral channels, and there is, in other words, quite a lot of Norwegian money through multilateral funding at country level, and this is also true for Uganda. The report emphasizes the lack of coordination and cooperation with the authorities after most donors cut budget support several years ago due to corruption. And while it is true that this change is relevant for the modalities of development cooperation, I would like to nuance the picture. One example is the extensive consultations carried out during the writing of the third National Development Plan, a process I was part of while in Uganda, where the government, the UN system, the multilateral banks and individual development partners had extensive discussions to ensure relevant input to the government's priorities in many sectors. Another example is the government of Uganda's work on developing the third National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, where there has been extensive consultations with donors across government institutions, also engaging civil society. And this work has been supported by Norway, both politically and financially, and is another example of how we work together with the government through other means than direct budget support. One of the main priorities for Norway in Uganda is our work within the energy sector. The Oil for Development program has for many years been the backbone of very close bilateral cooperation through capacity building and extensive technical cooperation. Norwegian investments in hydropower and support to renewable energy for almost 30 years have contributed to Uganda's development, since electric power is essential for the delivery of public services, job creation, economic growth, all in line with SDG number 7. As mentioned in the report, Uganda is one of the largest refugee hosting nations in the world, and the refugee laws are also among the most progressive. Norway is engaged in the refugee response, where we are providing support both through the UN system and through NGOs working actively to empower refugees. We also work with central and local authorities to help safeguard the sustainability of these interventions. The report rightly mentions that challenges remain in the areas of political rights, civil liberties, and economic, social, and cultural rights in Uganda. Norway provides substantial support to civil society and institutions working to improve the human rights situation and working for the rights of vulnerable groups, including the LGBTQI community. We have repeatedly expressed concern over the deteriorating human rights situation, and we are worried over the violence that erupted in connection to the recent elections, the lack of freedom of expression, to name a few of the challenges. And I look very much forward to discussing these and other issues during our discussion. We must continue to develop smart ways to engage on issues related to economic and political governance. Thank you.
Many thanks for that, Xenia. Very interesting and useful perspectives for our later dialogue. Before that, we also have with us another person with deep insight into the situation in Uganda. Monica Kyria is senior researcher at the U4 Anti-Corruption Center at the Christian Michelsen Institute. Monica is herself from Uganda. Her PhD thesis from 2011 was titled Performing Good Governance, Commissions of Inquiry and the Fight Against Corruption in Uganda. In it, she examined the role of aid conditionality and neo-patrimonialism on the appointment, process, and outcomes of ad hoc inquiries into corruption scandals in Uganda. We're eager to hear your perspectives on the situation in Uganda, Monica. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Norad, for inviting me to comment on the Uganda country evaluation brief. And thank you, Penela and the team at Particip, for a well-synthesized summary. The brief is spot on regarding the main challenges that Uganda faces in terms of its growing population, the youth bulge, and therefore the need to modernize agriculture. And it's also spot on regarding rampant corruption and human rights violations. Rather than comment on specific findings in the brief, I will focus my critique on the narrative and contextual underpinnings of the brief. When I was reading it, I was struck by two things. Firstly, the choice that was made regarding which parts of Uganda's history to recount, and secondly, the choices made by donors and their evaluators on what stories to tell and what stories not to tell regarding aid and its impact on Uganda. The brief notably starts its event timeline in 1962 instead of 1894, when Uganda first came into being as a British protectorate. In this way, it ignores pre-colonial and colonial history, which are vitally important for understanding the country's present-day political and socio-economic dynamics. For example, the inter-ethnic rivalry that we see and that has influenced various post-independence events such as civil war was stoked by the colonialists with their tactics of divide and rule. Colonial policy was also behind the regional inequalities that we see in wealth and income through policies that were adopted on ethnic specialization and division of labor. In addition, the homophobia was introduced to Uganda's laws via the notoriously conservative Victorian British attitudes. This brings me to the second point regarding which stories donors choose to tell or not to tell about aid and its impact. After all, aid is not just based on altruism, but is also influenced by nationalist and commercial interests. For many years, the NRM government worked hand in glove with the donors, who ignored or were underwhelming in their response to evident corruption, especially in the 1990s during Uganda's privatization process. Donors chose to ignore what was going on and instead referred to Uganda as an African success story. In this way, they contributed to the institutionalization of the NRM patronage system and allowed the current regime to consolidate power. On human rights violations, the brief singles out gay rights abuses, which are indeed a serious problem and which everyone should be concerned about. But it must be underlined that torture is by far the most recorded human rights violation in Uganda, and it is perpetrated mostly by the police and the army. The victims are mostly ordinary citizens and opposition politicians. In fact, a direct link can be made between state-sponsored violence and aid received by the country in the form of military assistance, mainly from the United States government, which provides over $170 million a year in military aid. With the recently concluded elections, it would appear that Uganda is nearly at boiling point, and it's uncertain which direction the country will now take. We could slice further into authoritarianism and military rule, or we could enter a new dispensation with dialogue and a smooth transfer of powers. Can donors influence which direction we will take? Can they take a firmer stance on the importance of dialogue and a smooth transfer of power, or will they seek to maintain the status quo? Thank you.
Many thanks indeed for that, Monica. We have now heard three different perspectives on the situation in Uganda and the international development assistance to the country. Let us now explore some of those issues further. Pernille, Xenia, and Monica, I would like you to reflect further on some themes and issues. And Monica, if I may, I'd like to start with you. You emphasized in your presentation the role of colonialism in sowing the seeds of many of Uganda's current ills, including such issues as inter-ethnic rivalry, regional inequalities within Uganda, and even the homophobia characterizing much of Uganda today. Is there a risk, though, that overemphasizing such historical factors might become a convenient excuse for the failure to drive political, social, and economic progress in Uganda today?
Thank you for that question, Jan Peter. I think that, yes, it could become an excuse, but I also would like to reiterate that we really can't solve today's problems unless we understand their root causes. And in order to understand the root causes of today's problems, we must go back into the past and try to see where things developed, how the seeds were sown, in order to be able to pull up these things from the root, instead of just clipping the tops and things grow again and continue to be problems. I think that one of the most important challenges facing not just Uganda but Africa in general is this sort of disconnect from history, and I think a sense of loss and identity of who we are as Ugandans, as Africans. And I think that sense of identity and understanding where we came from and how that influences the present is really important for us to solve the problems and to find our own solutions to problems. As the brief notes, there was a problem with sustainability, heavy reliance on donor aid, and to me, that shows clearly that we must be able to solve our own problems, and the only way to do that is really to remember who we are and try to see how we go on from here.
Thank you, Monica. And now I'd like to turn to Pernille. You noted in your presentation that budget support did help donors align their support to the government's policies, and also helped donor harmonization and coordination. Both alignment and harmonization seem to have suffered after budget support was reduced following the corruption scandal in 2012. Given the outcome of the recent elections, a return to budget support might appear unlikely in the near term. Absent budget support, what should donors do to improve alignment and harmonization?
Thank you very much for the question. Just one correction, maybe I wasn't completely clear. I think all the projects, even the ones which have been started or launched after the reprogramming from budget support to project intervention, they're all well aligned with the national strategies and the national development programs. So I think also that is a criteria for providing aid to Uganda. So I think that's not a problem. So I think overall that, I mean, what happened after the reprogramming to project interventions and to basket funding was that there was scattered approaches, scattered project interventions, and there was a problem with donor harmonization and less government involvement in programs, and the donors had less decision making, had less influence on government decisions. But I'm happy to hear from Xenia that actually the Norwegian embassy, they managed to have some quite good collaboration with the government despite this reprogramming. So your question is, what should happen after this new election, where we're not very likely to go back to budget support? I think apparently what the Norwegian government has done may be an example to follow, to still have some very good collaboration with the government. But even if there is a level of, or some degree of integration and collaboration with the government, I think that the challenge is still to have like full sector support. As we've seen from the projects, for instance, in the northern region, most of them are quite scattered. Also the ones which have been selected for this evaluation brief. They're very specific. They are there, for example, try to test some specific project approaches, for instance, in relation to HIV/AIDS or in relation to basket funded. So they are very, very scattered and very, very specific, very project specific. So I think one of the areas where I think there could be one way forward could be to have more multi-sector and multi-organization collaboration across, for instance, CSOs. I think, as I also mentioned in the presentation, one of the challenges or one of the shortcomings of the CSOs is that they are often very limited coverage, and there's also often very limited collaboration across the CSO. So I think that having a more multi-sectoral and more multi-organizational approach would partly assist in having a better results than what we are able to do currently.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Now, Xenia, you did touch upon some of these issues in your presentation, and you wanted to nuance, the view of reduced alignment and harmonization. Would you like to add something now to your previous words?
Sure, many thanks. I think, the report rightly mentions some weaknesses in terms of coordination, and not only with the government, but also among development partners, which are sort of constant challenges. But I wanted to nuance the picture a little bit, because I think it's important to emphasize that even though many donors now are not providing on-budget support, off-budget support is another means where we are cooperating with the government. And I mentioned the examples for Norway within the energy sector, but there are lots of other examples as well. And I also pointed out the developments of the National Development Plan number 3 and the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, because they show that there are several ways we can, as donors and members of the international community, cooperate with Ugandan authorities, even though we don't provide direct budget support.
Thank you. Now, Xenia, I'd like to hold on to you a little while longer. The report points to evaluation findings that while gender has been mainstreamed into many programs, it has still not been truly integrated into those programs. How can this be improved, given the great need to enhance lives and promote protection and well-being for women and girls in Uganda? And how can donors both achieve and better document results in this area?
Big, difficult and important questions. I'm not sure I have the answers to it. What I could say is that I think the report rightly points out that this is a challenge, and that's why gender equality is high on Norway's priorities within our development assistance to Uganda. I think Pernille's point on demography is very relevant. It's a key issue in Uganda, that the high population growth, which is approximately 3.3%. Every woman has around 5 kids. It's very, very high, so it sort of eats up the economic development. And Pernille's point on the need for family planning is very relevant. And perhaps I could highlight the role of the United Nations Population Fund and their work in Uganda, which is key. And they, together with, for instance, UN Women, work also very actively with local civil society organizations and NGOs to improve women's health, sexual and reproductive rights, and empower women. Now, you ask about gender mainstreaming, which is it's a challenge for all of us working on development assistance, not only in Uganda, but in all development assistance related projects. I think just, for instance, in Uganda, it's very high on the Norwegian political agenda. And it's actually an area within human rights where we find a lot of common ground with Ugandan authorities. I mentioned already the development of the National Action Plan for Women, Peace and Security, which is also related to women's rights and empowering women. So I guess I don't have a direct answer to your question, but just wanted to highlight the fact that this is high on at least the Norwegian agenda.
Thank you. Now, if I can come back to you, Monica, I'd like to touch upon another challenging issue in many countries, but certainly also in Uganda. Civil society has been experiencing a gradual tightening of conditions for years. The human rights situation, as you also pointed to, is harsh and getting worse, and democratic development seems to be going in the reverse. What should donors do to help Uganda strengthen the room for civil society, protect human rights, and help engender a more open political environment?
That's a really interesting and pertinent question. I think one of the things that we have to think about is, what is civil society? There's a tendency to conflate civil society with NGOs in much of the development work. And I think this has become a problem, and part of the reason why the government in Uganda and other countries has tried to, shrink the space for civil society. But really, what governments have done mostly is to make it harder for NGOs to operate by making registration requirements really difficult, and by harassing the leaders of prominent NGOs, as we see frequently happening in Uganda. But if we expand our thinking of civil societies beyond NGOs and consider lots of other ways in which citizens organize and get together to solve their own problems, and if we start to think beyond, what we think of as civil society, and include cultural associations, religious associations, savings and credit self-help organizations. If we really start to think of what actually happens at the grassroots, we can see a lot of potential to have more of a bottom-up notion of civil society rather than a top-down one. I think the main challenge for donors is really how to, and I know that donors in Uganda have tried to do this, grassrooting human rights, they called it, through the Democratic Governance Facility and the International Development Fund, how to grow more of these organic organizations that spring up through ordinary citizens agency, and rather than NGOs, and the NGOization of civil society in that sense. So I think that donors should continue to strengthen their efforts to develop what's happening at the grassroots, to support those grassroots organizations through small grants that they have already been doing, and connecting what those grassroots organizations are doing with the NGOs that work at mostly national level, and to support, I know they already are, there's a lot of donor support to networking and, building coalitions and trying to strengthen the voices of those who are, on the ground, as we call it, and they should definitely continue to do this.
And I just saw a notice in the papers about Museveni wanting to shut down this. I think it was the same fund that you just mentioned. Any response?
Yes, I was taken by surprise as well when I saw that, because the Democratic Governance Facility is a really key player in, changing the civil society landscape in Uganda and improving the governance and human rights situation. I found it kind of surprising that the president was sort of unaware all these years that DGF has been in existence of what they were doing. But I think we have to see this threat to shut it down as part of the larger and wider situation going on with tightening his rule and eliminating as many threats to power as possible. And I also am aware that the DGF funds several civil society organizations that are involved in election monitoring and, challenging human rights abuses and really speaking truth to power. And I think that's where it comes from. But I also think that actually DGF must support a lot of jobs in Uganda. I think that based on this, maybe the government will have to rethink this and maybe, as the request says, find a way to involve some government representatives more on the board of the Democratic Governance Facility. Hopefully they can come to a compromise. Yeah.
Thank you for that. Now, Xenia already touched upon an issue, in terms of the rapid population growth. In fact, if you translate the current rate of growth, you might see a doubling of the population of Uganda in 19 years. That's rapid. But another consequence is that there's a lot of youth in Uganda. It has one of the youngest populations in the world. Over half the population are children under 15. So what should be done, if I can turn to you, Pernille, what should be done to provide the necessary education and jobs at the massive scale needed? And sort of what is the division of labor here between the government and Ugandans themselves and donors?
Thank you very much. You are definitely not putting easy questions to us, but I'll try to respond. It's correct that this is a very, very critical issue, the youth unemployment, and this is particularly the case in the northern region, as I also mentioned in the CIB, where also the population growth is one of the highest in the country. And I think there are some few projects which are pointing to some solutions in terms of vocational training and entrepreneurship, etc., for youth in the northern region, even if these are still very small and limited in scope project. So I think one issue in relation to the division of labor between the government and the donors is that the government focus more on production, including agriculture and food security and infrastructure development, whereas the donors tend to focus more on the social sectors, including health, education, and WASH. So education has very much been funded by the donors through the budget support, and of course after this suspension or very heavily reduction of the budget supports, the support to this sector has somehow been challenged. So I think it's important, to the extent it is possible, to try to put more pressure on the government that they invest more in the education sector than what is previously done, what is currently being done. At the same time as the donors, they try to invest more also in education, including vocational training and as I mentioned, entrepreneurship, because obviously with this very high population growth, it is not possible to sustain all people based on agriculture only. Even if currently, as I also mentioned in the presentation, there's very much focus also from the government side on making the current subsistence farming more or a change towards more commercial agriculture. So there is some development in this direction, but the fact is still that it's not possible to sustain the population based on the current agricultural system. So there's definitely a need for more focus on education and training and off-farm activities in the rural areas.
Sure.
So,
thank you. I could see some nodding, and it would be tempting to ask Xenia and Monica as well about this, but I can see that time is running, and there is certainly one and probably a couple of more issues that we really should touch upon. President Yoweri Museveni was recently re-elected for another 5-year term in elections marred by a violent campaign and claims of fraud. And this question is really for all of you, but perhaps I could start with you, Monica. How do you envision a peaceful transition from the current regime to a younger, more progressive one, without falling into the traps that have appeared in other countries in Africa and elsewhere? How can donors help Uganda onto a more democratic path?
Oh, well, do I dare to dream? Speaking as a Ugandan citizen here and not as a governance expert. I think that for us as Ugandan citizens, it can be so easy to be lulled into this sense of things, especially those who are my age and older. You know, I'm not part of that young generation. So it's not easy for us to envision change. But one of the things that I think that donors should continue to support is or strengthen their support for is the professionalization of the bureaucracy and the civil service. I think that one of the biggest challenges that is going to hinder a peaceful and smooth transition of power is this fusion between the state and the bureaucracy through the patronage system, and the fact that many people who work as civil servants and public servants are loyal to the current regime. And when the president and his party usually present their manifesto, a lot of it, there's always, for a long time, he focused on the professionalization of the army. But one of the things I've never heard him talk about is the professionalization of the civil service, which is needed for service delivery and all the things that Pernilla highlighted in her summary, regarding health, education, WASH, all those things need an efficient civil service, and a civil service that is not tainted with ties to politics. I think that that could be one thing that donors could do, is to, as far as possible, promote the professionalization of the civil service. And as I said earlier, I think one of the most important things is to be firm and to make it clear in their dialogue with the Uganda government that it's really important to put in place arrangements for a smooth transfer of power, and to continue to support, the civil society as they've been doing, to continue to hold the government accountable as far as possible. And hopefully in the next few years, we can see a smooth transfer of power. I find it hard to say that without feeling like I'm engaging in wishful thinking, because obviously with the removal of term limits, it seems that Yoweri Museveni would like to rule for life, and he has quite a lot of support, even despite the fraud and the elections. It's really a difficult question for me, if only because I find it hard to analyze the situation objectively, and because I have all these emotional ties to Uganda, and sometimes thinking about these things can be a little bit painful, and it's easier to try and live in denial and say, well, maybe things aren't as bad as they seem, and maybe a miracle will happen and we will have a smooth transfer of power. Honestly, I could go on and on about this, but I think I should stop there.
Thank you so much, Monica. I'd also like to hear Pernille and Xenia elaborate a little bit. What are your thoughts and dreams for Uganda? What do you think should be done? Maybe Xenia first, please.
Thank you. I think I would like to answer by sort of expanding, because you asked what's the role of donors after elections. Perhaps I could comment on what's the role of the international community, because I mean we are of course donors to Uganda, but we're also international partners. And Norway has expressed concerns over the excessive use of force by the security forces in the run-up to the elections, the lack of a level playing field among political candidates, harassment of journalists, restrictions on freedom of expression. It's this is one of our tools in our toolbox in terms of expressing concern when a situation in a country is developing and deteriorating in terms of human rights. The role of donors is, our role as development assistant partners is of course not separate from our role as partners to Uganda as members of the international community. So I just wanted to highlight that aspect as well.
Thank you. And Pernille?
Thank you very much for the question. Another difficult question. I mean, I'm not very optimistic about a peaceful transition to another government. And I think the only path to achieve this is to strengthen the civil society and for the donors to keep responding on any abuse of human rights or any case of corruption by simply closing down the aid or decreasing it, or etc. I think that these cases where the donors have responded together, for instance, in the case of the corruption where the Prime Minister's office was involved, I think that is a case which shows that it does actually have an effect if the donors they act together. And there have also been other cases of corruption in, for instance, in the refugee camps and other places where the donors have responded. And I think the donor response, as well as focusing more on the civil society in order to achieve and enhance and strengthen civil society, I think this is the only way the donors can actually contribute to a peaceful transition sometime in many years. That's what I'm worried about. This is not something which will come overnight, and definitely will not come in the lifetime of Museveni.
Thank you so much. I do realize we are starting to run out of time, so we'll try one more question for each of you, but that will be your final response, and please be relatively brief because we need to finish on time in 5 minutes. Let's see. I'll go for the anti-corruption issue. The corruption scandal in 2012 illustrated a broader problem with corruption in Uganda. As elsewhere, there's a need to strengthen various control institutions and also civil society and the media, which you have also pointed to. How do you assess the status of these institutions in Uganda today? And what can and should donors and Ugandans do to turn the tide in a more positive direction? And perhaps finally, is it all useful to work to improve governance with a regime that seems to go in a less open and even more authoritarian direction? Pernille first, then Xenia, then Monica at the end. Pernille?
So which institution are you referring to? And you wanted a short answer. Yeah.
Public accounting, public sector reform, basically the auditing function, that also have technical competencies to follow up on corruption, but also in broader terms that which you already have touched upon in terms of an active civil society and indeed media that follow cases and dare to speak up.
I think Monica has much more knowledge about this than I have. I mean, it's it's a very broad the whole CEB is a very broad exercise when I'm looking at all types of aid. But my view is that, well, you're asking if does it make sense to keep supporting or providing aid to Uganda, which having all these issues and challenging in the whole public sector. And I think we don't have a choice. I mean, even if there are all these problems, well, there are still a lot of very, very poor people. I mean, the refugees is, of course, one challenge, but also the poor people in Karamoja and the challenges of the education, which you already mentioned. So I think we just have to continue supporting Uganda, as has also been the case in Kenya, where a lot of the aid has gone outside the government, and I think this is the roadway for
Thank you.
the donor aid.
Thank you. Xenia, briefly.
Sorry, I'll try to be very brief. You're asking whether we should continue to improve governance in authoritarian countries or countries who are on a path to authoritarianism. I mean, I want to answer by pointing out a few points on corruption and role of civil society and rule of law. I mean, to ensure impartiality and equal treatment, absence of corruption is crucial. Civil society, free media constitute important control mechanisms, contributing to public debate and inclusive and informed democratic processes. And rule of law is the backbone of a sustainable democracy. So governance efforts are key also going forward.
Thank you. Brief and beautiful. Monica, final words on this issue.
Yes, definitely. Donors have to continue engaging despite all the problems. I think they call it the Samaritan's dilemma, that, you know, if they stop giving aid, then the poorest people are likely to suffer the most. And because of this imperative, I think there's a need to find a way to cut out all the as much of the middlemen in the aid sector as possible, and see how to ensure that aid really benefits those who need it the most. And as to corruption, this is something that I'm an anti-corruption advisor, and it's something that I grapple with every day, and there are no easy solutions. But I think that ultimately, we as Ugandans have to confront exactly, and you know, not just Uganda, but all the countries where corruption is a big problem. We need to confront many questions about life in general. Sometimes I think that just focusing on corruption is the wrong thing, because I think that corruption is a symptom rather than a cause, and that it reflects the lots of values and fears and insecurities regarding humans and the current times that we live in. And I think in Uganda, I think those of you, maybe Xenia, Pernilla, you've been there. I don't know how much you have sensed of the culture and the mindset in Uganda, but there was an overwhelming obsession with money and an overwhelming obsession with wanting to be rich and wanting to make it in life. And I think this largely fuels corruption. And I think that, you know, it just doesn't come from governance and patronage. It comes from many sectors. You have pastors preaching that God wants people to be rich. And I think until we start to think about these things and think about really what is it about being rich that is driving people wanting more and more and more, and all these that desire to acquire more and more and more. If we don't confront these things in ourselves as individuals and in society as a whole, then there's not that much progress that can be made with technical solutions to corruption.
Thank you so much, Monica, and to all of you. Now, finally, the country evaluation brief for Uganda has been forwarded to the Norwegian MFA together with the other country evaluation briefs. In the cover letter, the evaluation department recommends that the CEBs be included as part of the knowledge basis for current and future Norwegian development assistance. I would like to extend a warm thank you to report author Pernille Sørensen and the team from Particip for producing an excellent report, and to Pernille for your presentation today of the main evaluation findings. I also thank Xenia Chrysostomidis and Monica Keria for adding important perspectives during today's webinar, and to all of you who have been with us today. Eventually, we hope the Uganda CEB and the other reports will be useful to you in your work towards Uganda's development. Warm thanks also to my project partner, Kristin Hauge, my colleague, Kjersti Løken, and Acting Evaluation Director, Siv Lillestøl, for invaluable support throughout this project. Finally, we look forward to the Evaluation Department's Indonesia webinar on Thursday, the 18th of February. We will revert to you with more detailed information about that webinar soon. Many thanks indeed to you all.